Good morning and welcome to Thursday Morning Japan Insights Room. Today we're talking with Dr. Jackie Steele, founder and CEO of Enjoy Diversity and Innovation Consulting, on why and under what conditions is diversity a driver of innovation. Jackie, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to have Enjoy Diversity and Innovation Consulting and what you're doing actually through the company?
Sure, and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Maya and Tim, for the invitation today. This is my second, I guess, attempt at joining a conversation on Clubhouse, and it's an interesting experience. So thank you for that. I guess I think I come out of a particularly Canadian experience of what academia and sort of public intellectualism can accomplish in terms of working, through research, public policy, and how Canadians can share, and certainly Canadian academics that I was mentored by had a really rich role and an exciting role in terms of working with parliamentarians and staffers, working with bureaucrats in different ministries who are wanting to improve the laws that shape and govern, of course, our country. And I think that is ultimately how I ended up in academia and in political science or political philosophy and law. I think I've always been drawn to trying to figure out these issues of inequality in society, and partly that came from my experience growing up as a girl, and certainly feeling that there were certain things that were not really panning out in terms of the promise of democracy or the promise of equality that I was taught to expect by my parents. My parents certainly instilled a belief that I could do anything and challenge anything and would be welcomed and appreciated for who I was. And yet often the pushback that I would get, even in Canada growing up, in the era of the 1980s, 90s, and certainly I think it hits hardest for young women, and I see this in Japan as well over the last 25 years, is that when you become an adult and you're into that sort of phase as a young woman, all of a sudden there's a lot of femininity boxes that are being placed on you. And all of a sudden your choices are being challenged around, is that going to be compatible with your family or your future husband or your this or your that? And I think all of a sudden I went, wow, what's happening here? How come my choices are somehow being undermined? And my access to just basic things that clearly those questions were not being put on the boys, the young men around me who I was, friends with. And that sort of shook, I guess, a curiosity in me to say, we have this promise of constitutional democracy, and we have this promise of, democratic self-government that says we're all equal. It says that, anyone can do anything. And certainly the message in Canada at the time was we had just adopted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. It took effect in 1985. So you really were at the peak of, we have achieved this major constitutional reform milestone that says women are equal, and it affirms it not only in Section 15, but also in Section 28 of our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I thought, that's not my experience of this. And so, again, I ended up sort of doing a deep dive after I had spent 3 years in Japan, pursuing a position here in a local government, and immersing myself in the Japanese language and Japanese culture, as I had really wanted to experience Japanese as a living language. After sort of 7 years of study in Canada, I went back and I joined a parliamentary internship, and I had the pleasure of serving with two amazing parliamentarians, one for the government side and one for the opposition side, to see the behind the scenes of Canadian politics and electoral politics. And then that set me back on a course of wanting to deep dive into how do we think about building, I guess, inclusion in our electoral systems, into our parliaments and into our political parties. And how do we make sense of why there aren't specific rules around making sure that the best competition of ideas is happening within our political parties, and the best competition and the most diversified competition of ideas is getting into our parliaments, because if those diversity of perspectives, of social identities, of lived realities, of all of that is not actually in Parliament at the point of deliberation and the point of debate and the point of then taking a decision on how to write the content into the law and the policy that will regulate our lives, then I was seeing that that critical moment of parliamentary debate needed to be fully diversified and fully invested in a rich competition of ideas, and that wasn't happening. We had a fairly white, parliament in Canada still. We had a fairly male-dominated parliament. We didn't really have a lot of LGBTQ folks in parliament. So I thought something's out of whack in terms of our political philosophy and what we say about constitutional democracy and what we actually do. And so that's been my 25 years, I guess, of journeying into understanding these contradictions, and where is the formal rules say X on paper of the constitutional democracy, but our cultural practices of power and equality actually manifest as Y. And it is why it is the cultural informal piece that takes over and that actually sets the tone of what is the lived experience of people, more than the pretty rules sometimes. And I think, how do we then engage in a change management system, right? A change management and cultural organizational shift or culture shift as a democracy, as a democratic ecosystem, and then how do we build that out? Certainly within companies is where I see the diversity and inclusion conversation in some ways struggling to deal with and grapple with. And so after, I guess 20 odd years of academics and research, international, looking at best practices, teaching, of course, as well as a professor of political science in Japan. I was in the National University system for about 15 years in a variety of postdoc and professor roles. I kind of thought I'm not seeing that academics in Japan have a large role as public intellectuals to inform public policy and to work with parliamentarians, to work directly with civil servants, to really work in a constructive way to share law reform ideas. And that dialogue I didn't really see happening in my experience in Japanese academia. So 2 years ago, I started plotting a course to say, well, if I want to have those conversations directly with the leaders who are making these decisions for companies and for the civil society and for our laws, then perhaps it's time to go independent, I guess, if you will. And so I created Enjoy Diversity and Innovation Consulting, so I could have more of a direct public impact, I guess, in that sense, and work with senior leaders to help them grapple and work through these challenges that are both, they're both political philosophy, they're about ethics, they're about our rules of engagement and our corporate laws, our corporate policies. But it's also about understanding that the informal culture, if we don't regulate that and curate that really intentionally, all of the toxic dynamics of inequality will take over. So that's been the work that I've been focusing on, and have found it exceptionally rewarding to speak with so many different types of stakeholders. And I guess the key reason why I chose to recode diversity and inclusion for my company as diversity and innovation is I really do believe fundamentally in the importance of a robust and diversified competition of ideas that is collegial, that is productive, that is constructive and friendly, and how that kind of a dynamic leads to innovation. Whereas often we see that, the D&I conversation as it is diversity and inclusion, there's an assumption that if we get a whole bunch of diverse people into the company, all of a sudden there'll be inclusion. And then the conversation shifted to, well, no, there won't be inclusion probably. We need belonging. And so now it's a belonging conversation. And in my experience of studying power dynamics for 25 years, inclusion and belonging, when they are cast in these sort of, I guess, apolitical ways, it completely misses the point of the fact that there are informal power inequalities at work in our society and in our culture. And we need to tackle that head on through change management systems that make it impossible for those kinds of toxic power dynamics to thrive in our ecosystem. And to do that, that's a really conscious build out, and it's a philosophically and ethically grounded build out, and it's also a technical build out that understands political psychology as well. So it's a more complex process, I think, than sometimes the D&I conversation admits of. And for me, that's really part of the exciting challenge and the opportunity is to share how do we re-understand and reframe so that we can get innovation and we can build out sort of diversity positive ecosystems that will actually be able to deliver on this piece of innovation that everyone is sort of parroting as the business imperative, right? The business imperative for diversity is innovation, but curating innovation to actually be in the ecosystem is not a simple process. And it's not just about having a whole bunch of diverse people thrown together. So, that's, I guess, where we're at, and that's where I'm working.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, obviously, this is a long process. I mean, introducing diversity, well, and before that, probably belonging and inclusion. So, but because it is a long process, and I believe that especially in countries like Japan, which are, where the culture is more or less, let's say, accepted universally, I mean, by the society and their societal norms and expectations. So, do you find it more difficult here, to persuade leaders that they need to be more inclusive, or and if it is not the case, then how do you do that? I mean, how do you let them actually warm up, to the ideas of let's say cultural diversity and diversity positive environments, and so do you use any metrics to persuade them about that, and well, what is your approach in general?
I think one of the challenges, I mean, I suppose I've been a Japan Canada comparative politics specialist, and if I think about sort of the unique challenge that we see in Japan, it in part comes from, you're correct in identifying this sort of sense of universal acceptance around what Japaneseness means, I guess. And I think that's a challenge as a political scientist perspective from my view, because when you look and you take the long view of Japan and the historical long view, Japanese culture and Japaneseness, if you want to call it that, has really evolved, of course, over history and over time. And what is often quintessentially, pointed to as this is the only one-way, monolithic way of Japanese culture, of being Japanese, is really something that comes from the post-World War II context. And in some ways, there is a whole mythology around Japaneseness, or what we call Nihonjinron, that is very specifically rooted in the post-World War II elite views that were trying to mobilize a sense of togetherness and a sense of identity for the country to engage in a catch-up, right, with the West post-World War II after, what was a very difficult defeat. And so, unfortunately, that sort of Nihonjinron, or that Japanese, that discourse on Japaneseness, has narrowed the field of what is included in so-called traditional Japanese culture. And it's made it only one version of the story. And what is, I think, fascinating for me, and certainly in my research, I had the pleasure of unleashing, or I guess discovering and doing deep dives into, was the fact that there is a tremendous diversity in what we call, Japanese society and Japanese culture, and what is, the Japanese national community. So whereas people like to say, oh, we point to Canada or we point to the United States as being countries built on diversity, and we say that Japan is the opposite of that, we see in the research of political scientists and legal scholars and ethnocultural scholars worldwide who focus on Japan, that actually there really is a tremendous diversity. We see Japan obviously had the experience of colonization and of building empire, just like the West, right? And what does that mean when you're engaging in empire building and you're colonizing other countries? other peoples is you bring in those entities into your own national identity and your national cultural mix, right? So we've got a tremendous history of Korean descent Japanese in Japan. We have a tremendous cultural diversity of, what is now Okinawa, but was the Ryukyu Kingdom, and those cultural distinctiveness and linguistic distinctivenesses. That's a part of Japan. We've seen, obviously, the indigenous people in the Ainu in the north, in Hokkaido and other parts of northern Japan, also having their own cultural distinctiveness and linguistic differences. We've had influxes of immigration for a long time in Japan. People who don't just stay and work temporarily and go home. They stay. They have kids. We have a tremendous breadth of newcomer communities from Indonesia, from Brazil, from Vietnam. There's always been a strong presence of different immigrant wives from the Philippines, from Korea, from a lot of different places. And so this diversity lives here in Japan at a sociological level, but it never has recognition in the actual discourse or the elite definitions of Japanese national identity and Japanese national country formation and nation building, but it lives here, and so there's sort of a disconnect, and this is where I think my views and my research on finding the disconnects in Canada, and then having the tools and the critical thinking and the understanding of then how to find those disconnects in the law, and how we think about the country and the culture for Japan has really shown me that there is this breadth of diversity in Japan. LGBTQ folks have always been in Japan and been a part of Japan, whether acknowledged or not legally, and still, of course, not really fully recognized with a lack of same-sex marriage legally on the books. So I think I challenge individuals who are in Japan to start looking at the real diversity that is here rather than falling back on the mythologies of traditional Japanese culture is X, and it can only be X, and it's always been X, because that's not the case. I mean, even if you look at the head of the household family structure and the EA system, it's evolved over time. There has always been, the opportunities for women to be heads of the households and for men to marry in to that lineage. We've had experiences of, not necessarily everyone sharing the same surname. And certainly that was very much a middle upper class or even an upper class, dynamic of having a head of household surname that mattered, that you had to worry about lineage. I mean, it was a very, like in the rest of our countries, even in the common law, the head of the household and the focus on patriarchal and patrilineal lineage is really something that is an elite preoccupation, right? It's tied to inheritance laws and passing on of wealth down through, the eldest son. And we have that as primogeniture in the common law countries, as the way it used to play out in the family head of households structure and the inheritance law in common law countries. And we have the EA system and the head of the household, Koseki system in Japan, or family registry, that's doing that as well. These are legal fictions, right? We make them and we change them over time. And as we decide that we want our head of household system to disappear because it's inegalitarian on a gender basis, then we make a law reform and we eliminate it. And we did that in Canada. We've done that in the United States. We've done that in many different countries. So these diversities of family, household, of cultural practices, of ethnocultural and ethno-national mixing, I think, frankly, has been in Japan, is in Japan. It's simply not affirmed in the legal dynamics of having dual, citizenship, or acknowledging that, for example, if you've been here and you're fourth generation Korean Japanese, we never call each other. We would never call that person Korean Japanese, like Korean descent Japanese, in the way that in Canada we would talk about, for example, my spouse being Japanese Canadian. We do a hyphenated identity expression that says we're actually nationality passport belonging to this beautiful country and political community, having citizenship, but of ethnocultural descent in this area. We don't use that language yet in Japan because we're not formally yet an immigrant receiving country. There are increased numbers of diverse workers from around the world who come on visa statuses to be migrant workers in Japan, but it's not formally set up to be, we want to bring over this amount of immigrants per year, like
Right.
other immigrant receiving countries. And so that's a really distinct point for Japan to struggle with. And I think from taking off my political science hat and I guess putting on the CEO of Enjoy hat, what we see in terms of unique pressures for companies and for leaders, particularly with the declining birth rates in Japan and aging society phenomena, we see, increasing competition for diverse talent and for global talent across the globe, right? Not just in Japan, but across the globe and certainly across Asia. And we see that, the statistics out of Oxford Economic, out of a report they did called Global Talent 2021, how the new geography of talent will transform human resource strategies, it shows that Japan's supply of educated talent is only going to expand by about 0.4% in the coming decade. So due to, declining birth rates, we see 0.4% of increase in educated talent compared to much, much higher rates. So in the 46 countries that they studied, Japan was second to last in terms of the ability to source, educated talent. And that's to do with the university system and how many people are going to university, and it's also due to declining birth rates. But what that means is that if you're continually closed to immigration of large numbers of skilled talent and global talent and certain skill sets, then the net result that this report, the Oxford Economic Report, suggests is that Japan is going to have basically a talent deficit in the coming decade. And that's going to be the second largest talent deficit of these 46 countries. So there's tremendous pressures, I think, on leaders to grapple with if global talent and educated talent is really the next battle for innovation in companies and for competitive edge. And if Japan is maintaining this course of having migrant workers but not really having immigration as a full-born strategy to bring in, I guess, educated talent and top talent, as in other countries do, how do you build, I guess, an ecosystem, a corporate ecosystem and a workplace environment that is attractive and that can bring in those individuals and their families, frankly, because they rarely come alone. And how can Japan, as a society, and Japanese companies compete against, I guess, other more multicultural societies where English is already used, like in Singapore or Hong Kong and others in Asia? And it puts a lot of pressure. And so we're seeing a shift in how leaders are reframing, I guess, how they understand the importance of diverse talent management. And we've seen a change in perspective. So there was another survey I found to be quite interesting by the Economic Intelligence Unit 2021, doing a survey of around 50 executives from Japanese companies with, large, Japanese companies. And 82% of those companies now think that the availability of talent is absolutely the vital external factor for their innovation strategy. And so there's a shift towards thinking about global talent management, whereas in the past, we've seen that actually oftentimes talent management or talent development has not been seen as a high priority by CEOs and senior leaders in Japanese companies. And so it was pushed and delegated down the pipeline, and it sort of lives somewhere in HR as a management problem for HR to solve in a little silo. But it wasn't tied to business strategy, and it wasn't tied to overall competitive edge, and it wasn't really seen by CEOs and the presidents as something they needed to actively now caregive to make sure that their company could compete. And so that's a really interesting shift. And I think given Japan's, desire to maintain, I think, certain elements of Japanese culture and a nervousness around immigration, I think we might see these issues shift and move the dial towards more innovative, I guess, alternatives around. I think citizenship and dual citizenship is not yet palatable to the political elite in Japan. But are there other innovations, for example, in terms of permanent residence, Maybe they don't have the access to dual citizenship to that extent, but there's different innovations we see around the world, and that could be thought of for Japan as well, in terms of treating permanent residents with completely equal rights to citizenship, except for perhaps voting and participating in national elections. But perhaps there could be acknowledgement of their ability to have political voice and participate more actively in the democracy side of things at the local government level and in the prefectural level. Maybe that could be a space of dynamic innovation where there could be voting, right? Voting and participation by permanent residents who are paying taxes, are contributing, are full-fledged members of the society. They choose Japan as their adoptive home. That's one, I think, political democratic innovation we could maybe see, so that Japan could also get a sense of these people are really a part of their population for the long term and are part of the, I guess, the talent that needs to be mobilized fully and not always defined as gaijin, right, as gaikoku, as outsider, because I think so many of the individuals and the fourth and fifth generation, but also the first generation international families, often they're here for the long haul and they're making long-term investments in Japan, but the return is not necessarily the return investment into them as permanent contributors here and as a part of the fabric of Japan is not changing the way that the political elite talks about Japaneseness, if you will. But I do think that companies are seeing that tension, and company presidents and CEOs are seeing that and thinking, okay, how do we move the dial and how do we help our political elites think about things differently? How do we help our political elites open up to more global talent? How do we build an environment that could be a good ecosystem and a hospitable country for them to want to stay for the long haul, because we need this talent to stay. And I guess I think it's interesting because in Canada in the 1990s, there was this whole huge conversation about the brain drain from Canada into the United States. The brain drain that Canada was constantly experiencing, that we had public university system that was funded, which meant that people could go to university and you only paid roughly you paid maybe 20% of the actual cost of your university degree because it was publicly funded. So Canada was churning out just degrees and degrees and educated top talent. And of course, the United States could offer more competitive salaries. And so we would see a brain drain. And I think this is one of the difficulties of immigration and globalization now in 2021 is talent can move. And the brain drain is a real phenomenon. And so there's pressures not only on advanced democracies to become hospitable environments for diverse talent and to build an egalitarian system where that talent can feel they will be able to thrive without surviving microaggressions constantly or harassment or things like that in their workplace nor in their society. Building that up is a real consideration, not just for parliamentarians. It's a consideration that is really important now and affects corporate leaders. And having those broader public debates about what is the good life and what is Reiwa Japan going to look like, and how do we build the most competitive and diversified and robust and vibrant, because Japan is so dynamic and has so much to offer as a G7 country in Asia. How do we build that Reiwa Japan inclusive sense of citizenship and also inclusive, more flat, agile, egalitarian culture in companies? And when I speak about these possibilities, I think the leaders who I'm speaking with, I think they see an alternative vision of Japan that isn't really being talked about. That, the beauty of Japanese culture and all of those traditions aren't going to die simply because there's immigration, for example. I think that the best of a culture always lives on because it has universalizing truths to it that people from around the world come to love and honor and want to protect. And there's so much of that in Japanese culture that I see not only foreigners taking on as a part of their own personal culture and admiring and wanting to have that as part of their legacy to their kids, but that I think people around the world see in Japanese culture. But there's elements that we also, need to do away with. I mean, so gender inequality is not something that really is rooted in, I think, Japaneseness. It was rooted in all cultures, and we've eliminated it and dismantled those power dynamics in all different countries in different paces and speeds. And I think it's time for Japan to take that particular element and separate it from Japanese culture, because it's not unique to Japanese culture. And it doesn't help Japanese culture. It doesn't help Japan be inclusive and egalitarian and competitive. We've seen that, right? We've seen how the gender gap just is a drain on the Japanese economy and a drain on happiness and well-being for families. But also, I think the ways in which Japaneseness tied to a very narrow sense of race is also not helping Japan. And we see that this is the globalization phenomenon where diversity of ethno-racial descent and even LGBTQ diversity, those pieces, they're already a part of Japan. They just need to be allowed to exist as something that's a part of Japanese culture in a Reiwa era that would be, I think, more democratic. And I think that is an exciting possibility, and I think there's a lot of corporate leaders that are heading in that direction and want that and are looking for these, I guess, more philosophical but also legal understandings of how do we move the dial? How do we move the dial on the broader democratic ecosystem? How do we move the dial for our companies within this ecosystem and these cultural constraints? So that's where I think things are. I'm hearing from senior leaders back when I present these ideas.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, I love the point which you made about, diversity being here, but it's more like, it's present and it's just not on the surface because people don't talk about it. And, how it is actually, the different levels at which we can work to further, let's say, make diversity and inclusion let's say a more accepted or visible issue here in Japan, because you mentioned political level, also corporate level, and social level. So probably that public debate needs to take place on all those three levels. And I don't know whether which level is the best one to start with and to start at. But obviously, there is that necessity to actually make things more visible to everybody in society. And I have seen that actually in my, at work, because it's very interesting how, of course, consensus is the most important point when there is, a project, or, when the company or the organization is moving towards a goal. And then, of course, everybody gives their consensus at some point of time so that the organization can move ahead. But when you actually meet people informally after work, and you share a drink and you just chat, so there's so much difference in opinion about what is going on in the company, even after people giving their consent about this. So it's really a fascinating aspect of corporate life. And I believe that probably it's more or less, or it's probably similar, at the other two levels, the social and political level as well. But as you said, probably some historical reasons still persist and make this debate a kind of, let's say, a little bit difficult at present. But, I believe that Japan is changing because, as you said, a lot more people are actually open to influences from overseas, from other cultures and countries. With all the connectivity we've got. So, and my personal opinion too is that the Japanese culture is not going to disappear. There will be some influences, of course, and probably some changes and alterations, but it's going to stay here because there are so many good things which people just love about this country and this culture. So there is no way for these things to disappear, the traditions, and values and so on. So, and I see Tomoko-san, thank you very much for coming up. Please go ahead. I'm sure that you've got a lot to say and to comment.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit late because of my previous engagement. So I missed the first part, but I've been thinking about the issue we'll be hearing is that this is Japanese tradition, historically speaking, and so on, or this is Japaneseness kind of. the kind of things. But we have 1,000 years history, right? It means what kind of history people, or especially politicians or senior citizens, are talking about. It's just only I don't know how many years they are thinking about, but we've been living so many different eras of different histories with different tradition, and it means we can change. And we've been absorbing so many different cultures and religions and beliefs and so on from everywhere. So that why can't we change again is something I've been thinking. So this is a really good time for people to rethink about what we want for our future, not for the past, but for the future. Since we are supposed to have more time than before COVID-19.
That's a really, really excellent point, Tomoko. I mean, I think from my experience of researching Japanese cultural traditions over the generations and the different periods, there is really a diversity of Japanese traditions, and there's a diversity of Japanese culture and cultures. And I think you're right. This is the moment, and I think I have high hopes for the Reiwa era to be this period of, I think, transformation where there could be a more, I think, intentionality, I guess, from Japanese leaders across all different industries and stakeholders to think about the goal is not just to preserve what was done. That's not culture. That's preservation. And that's not thinking about democratic innovation and nation building with critical distance and with critical thinking to say, okay, which part of our culture we really think is amazing. We think it's consistent with democratic equality. We think it's consistent with what we take to be one of the best things about humanity, or about aesthetics, or about art, or about, there's so many different pieces. But I think first and foremost, I keep encouraging a critical reflection on, we have a constitutional democracy in Japan. What is the promise of that constitutional democracy, and are we living up to it? And if we're not living up to it because there's power inequalities, because there's power differences that are status-based, based on, oh, you tick the box and it says female, so that status means you're less than. Or if it means you tick the box and you're a foreign descent, and therefore you can't really be included in the Japanese family registry. You need to be put on the foreigners' family registry. These box-ticking exercises that are inconsistent with democratic equality need to be innovated and renovated and brought into alignment with equality, the promise of democracy and self-government, because we're all here as members of this constitutional democracy, and whether we're permanent residents with, external to political rights in that sense, or part of citizenship and a national with voting rights as well, I think there needs to be this absolute critical thinking on what is the Japanese culture and Japanese national identity that we see as consistent with equality and freedom and self-government and inclusion. And then let's renovate our laws and policies to become in alignment with that. And I think that is what social movements have been trying to do with not a lot of success in Japan. They don't have a lot of influence to get law reform through the parliament, and companies are wanting change, and companies are having troubles lobbying the political elites to get certain law reforms through. And there's pressure building on political elites to move away from the sort of bury your head in the sand and be preservationist about everything that was, because everything that was is the way, when it's not the way. And if it were the way, we would see very different metrics on how Japan performs on attractiveness as a place to live, and in terms of the gender gap, and in terms of just LGBTQ rights, there would be different performance for Japan as a nation amongst advanced democracies. Japan would perform better if it were having these changes and evolutions happen through their legal frameworks and the metrics of what democracy means. So that's, I think, the first metric I like to direct people to, even corporations. Do you understand how Japan as a democracy performs on all of these data points around diversity and inclusion? Because that is the first ecosystem that we all live in, and that we all need to take seriously from a position of we all are a part of nation building. And even if we're permanent residents, we're part of the nation building fabric, and we can contribute and have a say and join the public debate and join these conversations. And I guess Clubhouse is making that easier for us. And certainly one of the ways, Maya, I feel as a company we're trying to move the dial in terms of visibility building. Mm-hmm. I have a thought partner network. That's about 100 people. Most of them are based in Japan. These are all leaders of diverse and thought leaders, I think, and thought partners to me, who are diversity positive. They're moving and shaking in their own industries or in their own professional areas, be it academia or tech or marketing or creatives. They're all over the place in Japan, and they walk and talk a diversity positive logic of Japaneseness. And they are both foreign national and Japanese national, but they are part of the fabric of Japan. So for me, that was one sort of tactic, I guess, to make visible that diversity positive leadership is here in Japan, and it needs to be praised and celebrated. So I'm trying to elevate and amplify those individuals. And then I invite them to my live stream that I host every Tuesday at 12 p.m. And I feature one of those leaders to say, let's do a deep dive into who you are, what are your diversities and your complexities as an individual, and how does that relate to your work here in Japan and how you see Japan? And these individuals love Japan. They're so diverse, and they all love Japan. And they all really want the best for Japan. And so I think showing that there is this tremendous group of individuals who are both diversity positive and Japan loving, that these are not inconsistent ideas. It's not just those who protect traditional, Japan and Japanese culture who love Japan. There's a whole bunch of people, right, who want the best for Japan and who are preservationist through innovation and inclusiveness, right? And I think that's a different visibility factor we need to keep promoting it. And I think that's the point of your Japan Business Insights too. I think that's one of your goals.
Yes. I just wonder, whether we are probably one of the obstacles, to getting diversity, the talk about diversity and inclusiveness. One of the first obstacles, isn't it that generational culture? I mean, we all know that, just it is an observation and it is a fact that, basically people in politics belong to older generations, and they have grown up, with that mindset, of the uniqueness of Japan. I mean, which to a certain extent is true, of course, but at the same time for them, for most of the people, and it's very human anyway, for most of the people, once they pass a certain age, it's really difficult to become more open to new ideas and, change your mindset. So I was just wondering whether, this is one of the major obstacles. Basically, we need a change in generations. So especially in politics, before we are actually able, to engage more politicians in this debate.
I would agree with you, Maya, on one sense that I do see that the blockage is very much in the political elite that is in Parliament, and within certain groups within that political elite. It's not all parliamentarians who are preservationist and resisting law reform on these areas. There are certain preservationist conservative factions within parliamentarians, and they happen to have a majority of the seats. And so even if I don't think, in my view, there are LDP thinkers and parliamentarians who are very open-minded and very open and open to diversity and equality. But there's also demographic within the LDP that is very preservationist and more conservative. And if that party can't move to get towards the point of allowing their what is essentially control of parliament with a majority of seats, if they cannot internally broker a new vision that allows law reform to go through and allows more equality and allows more openness to innovating Japan and Japanese-ness or Japanese culture, if there's no consensus built within the LDP, we will not be able to get those laws through Parliament. It's a numbers game. At the end of the day, it's a numbers game, right? Yeah. Elections are about majority rule in the Parliament, and at the moment of decision, it is who has 50% plus one of the seats. And within that party, if they don't have an openness as a party towards the law reform content, then that's going to die. That's going to die on the order paper, and we won't see that law come into effect. So I think that there's a huge need for the LDP itself to really do some really introspection around what Japaneseness are we going to build, and how do we listen to the people who we serve? Because I think that, we've seen votes and surveys from young people, from women, from men, from people of all different, sections of the population. The surveys that come back around, issues of women having the right and men having the right to have separate surnames in marriage, there's a pretty strong consensus in favor of that. So why isn't there listening to the people that are being served by that law and letting the people decide for themselves? That's what self-government means, right? We listen to the people of what they want as a rule for regulating their own freedom. So it's not up to the LDP to continue to decide, and it's certainly not up to the more conservative factions of the LDP to decide for the whole country. And I think being, servant leadership and listening, understanding that being in electoral office doesn't mean that you decide for everyone. You don't have control. You don't get to control things. You have to listen to what people seem to think reasonable as a rule to regulate their law. And then you bring that into effect in a policy change. And that listening to the population, because in my experience in rural Japan, I work with so many progressive, open-minded 60 to 85-year-olds. So I don't see it as a problem of the 60 to 85-year-olds in rural Japan or regional Japan. I don't see them as holding things back. They want young people to have freedom. They support young people's choices. They are actually, realizing that their way of having been raised really meant that they had to do a lot of self-sacrifice, and why bother with that? That's not logical. They don't want to see their children self-sacrifice. They don't want to see their daughters self-sacrifice anymore. And so those men and women, and I say in Inaka, I'm in Inaka, right? These are people I've had relationships of trust with for 25 years. They've been open-minded. So I do think there's a bottleneck of gatekeeping in the parliament and in the diet, unfortunately. And particularly, I think within the LDP, there's some really hard choices in conversations about letting go of control so that parliament is not top-down dictating to the population of Japan, but rather Japanese people are given the freedom, and young generations are given that freedom to decide the rules of togetherness that they want to live by as a nation. And let that become a self-governing logic where the parliamentarians really start listening. I think that's where we need change.
Thank you. I think that, okay, Tomoko-san and Stephen, I believe that you were going to comment or, probably ask questions. So please go ahead. Tomoko-san.
No, Steve, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning, Jackie. I can listen to you all day. That's very, very nice. And I have a question about why do you think we experience that pushback? Is it more cultural or economical? Do you have any insight on that?
Do you mean the pushback
for diversity, and what do you think from the people that are pretty much against the diversity? Why do you think they have that fear or diversity?
I guess if we're thinking, one of the things that I use as my tagline for my company is the tagline "Diversity Rocks." And I use this in a dual sense, eyes wide open, because I think when you're drinking from the Kool-Aid of the diversity and inclusion, pro-diversity conversation, you absolutely think that diversity rocks. Like, it's just fabulous, right? It's exciting. You're open to curiosities about other people, about other cultures, about food, about, how things are done there. You want to travel. You want to understand the full complexities of humanity as it lives in different cultures and people and groups, and value propositions about what the good life is. And you're interested in that, and you think that's fabulous. And then there's also the sort of diversity rocks your worldviews. It's like, whoa, who are these people coming in with these radical ideas that are so different from what I'm used to when I was, born and raised in? And then they come into our country and they bring they want to change things, and they don't follow our way of doing things, and they don't conform, and they don't comply, and they challenge my sense of self. They challenge my sense of, I was born and raised with this culture, and I was taught this is the right way to be. And now people are coming in and doing things differently, and that's changing my sense of security about what is the right way to be in the world. And I think it rocks your sense of worldview, it rocks your sense of values, and whether you feel a sense of confidence in who you are and how you've made value decisions for your life and for your country and for your cultural, what you take to be, esteemed in your culture. And I think diverse perspectives and diverse social groups bring that in, right? I think that we need to take seriously that there's a discomfort around that initially until you can feel a sense of confidence in how you are in the world, and how it's okay, and there's more than one way of being in the world. There's more than one arikata, ikikata, and that it doesn't threaten your own way and your own choices. So seeing that we can live in harmony, in solidarity, as people following different ways of living and making different choices, be it around family formation or who you love or who how you want to self-name after marriage, all of that diversity, it doesn't have to undermine and threaten who you are just because other people do it differently. But I think it comes back to that. We have to have a sense of confidence. And I think Japan is struggling with finding its confidence in its national identity, in its cultural identity, and in how it absorbs certain parts from diversities around the world and globalization, and how it chooses and makes decisions around what not to absorb and what we want to maintain. And I think that's a growing pain. It's a national growing pain. And I know Canada went through this in the 80s and 90s. And finally, Canada came to peace with our Canadian national identity is going to be built around our democratic values and our Constitution and our practices of freedom. And we invest heavily now in curating this sense of that's what Canadian identity means. Nationally, right? We want to build a space of inclusion and diversified freedom as our kind of citizenship, identity, and pride. And so we really build that out, and we intentionally support that through our policies and laws. But before that, we were in a sense of how are we different from the Americans? What makes us different? I don't know how we're different. We need to figure out how we're different from Americans. What is the national identity crisis that I think Japan is living, and that therefore makes, I think, the most conservative elements of the political elite who are in power with the strings to parliament, pulling the levers, deciding and trying to figure out if they're not feeling confident about what to let in, then first I think it's about really centering on how do we take pride in what is the democratic parts of Japaneseness. So we can also be willing to consider that there's multiplicity of ways of being Japanese. And that alone, I think, is a huge paradigm shift for many people. And it leads to a sense of confidence, hopefully, that they don't have to feel threatened by diversity. And I think there is that psychological element and emotional element that we have to be respectful of, and I think we have to be empathetic about that. Even if it's frustrating, I think we do have to empathize with that, because there's a struggle there that those people are feeling.
Do you feel like there's a positive evolution in terms of gender diversity in the corporate world or government?
I think that gender is one of those cross-cutting issues that is going to make or break the Reiwa era for Japan, as well as other facets of, LGBTQ inclusion and immigration issues. Those three together. But gender, obviously, given the population demographics of, it affects, 50-50, it affects all 100% of the population, because it doesn't just affect women. I think there's been some progress in getting women into paid labor, but I think that the conditions of the paid labor contracts that they're in is often putting them in a very toxic environment that actually exposes them to more power harassment potentially. And so I think it's the conditions of those work contracts that really needs to be thought through, and the ecosystems in those companies, whether they're, supportive actually of gender equality. Otherwise, we're sending a whole bunch of women into paid labor into a toxic environment that treats them as less than every single day of their life, and they're exposed to microaggressions in their paid work life. And is that empowering? I have some questions around that, and I think we need to take seriously the ecosystem bill so that they are hospitable environments for women to not be denigrated daily for paid work. Because people, if you're a breadwinner in your family or a single mother, you don't have a choice to quit that job. And so if those contracts are precarious, if they're not the lifetime employment, permanent position, you're under extreme precarity and at risk of losing your job, and you don't feel you have the right to speak back if someone's sexually harassing you, or if somebody is just denigrating you constantly with, the way they speak to you and things like that through power harassment. So I think we really have to now tackle not just getting more individuals, diverse bums in chairs into those companies. It's like, what is the ecosystem build out that needs to happen in the change management to make that a hospitable, diversity positive, women's leadership positive, queer positive space that honors the individuality in all of those different people, men as well, so that they're not boxed into being a corporate warrior either. I mean, all of that, I think, there's tremendous work to be done for men's freedom, for women's freedom, and also for acknowledging the LGBTQ and non-binary realities of Japan, too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Okay, we've got Kumi coming up now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hello, and
Thank you so much for having me up. Hello.
Hello, can you hear us?
Hi.
Yes.
Yes,
Please,
I can hear.
yes.
I'm so sorry. I'm actually outside, but I was just so intrigued with Jackie's comments, and I just couldn't really help myself but to ask a question.
Please go ahead, yes.
Thank you. Hi, Jackie. I really appreciate the thoughts that you shared regarding the Japanese culture, and also the thoughts that you put into the Japan that needs to change at some point. And I currently work and reside in Vancouver, and I'm involved with language instruction for newcomers to Canada. And I just have a question, because I'm kind of out of touch from Japan, which is the place that I used to grow up. Do Japan have sort of like a similar language program? Do they offer do you know if there's any, the corporate, government, community, municipality, anywhere, do they offer a language program that makes the settlement easily for newcomers in Japan to integrate into the society?
Very good question.
I'm just so curious because you're talking about, inclusiveness, and I am pro diversity and inclusiveness, and my life in Canada has changed the way I think about stuff, and it's just a huge paradigm shift because I did grow up in Japan. So yeah, I just wanted to know your thoughts about it too.
Thanks. This is a really excellent question because and unfortunately the answer is that there is an effort within different prefectures, I would say, and at the local level to try and think through the pain points that immigrant families experience in terms of Japanese as a second language for their children in the public school system. But there's not actually an official nationwide Japanese as a second language strategy because, of course, Japan isn't an immigrant receiving society. So formally speaking, if it's not formally saying it's receiving immigrants, then building up the ecosystem, the educational structural supports for immigrants doesn't need to happen. And I think this is one of the key areas where we see a huge disconnect because there is a huge need for this infrastructure to be built across the education system, the national education system. But that doesn't happen because there's not immigrant receiving formal commitments from Japan. to then be this host society saying, come, be here and stay here permanently, and we will support you in this integration way by having Japanese as second language supports. We will have, other supports at all the different city hall locations, so you can always get supports and have translation. So it's really hit and miss based on the local level and based on the levels of immigration or migration or permanent residents who are building a critical mass of people such that the schools get to the point where they're like, oh my goodness, we can't cope, and the principals go to the Board of Education and say, help, and then the boards of education turn around and say, if it's elementary and junior high, then they're looking to the city governments who are strapped for funding and don't really have a lot of capacity to build out a whole infrastructure for Japanese as a second language training.
Right.
Nor do they have the personnel who could teach that and who are trained in that. And then at the high school level, it goes to the prefectural level. Mm-hmm. So I know in Nagano, for example, Nagano Prefecture has a small program that they're trying to pilot where they're having resource teachers who could potentially rotate around Nagano Prefecture to help the school that might have a need, but it's a one-off organic responding to a critical need at a given time in one given school, not having a permanent resource nor program for those individuals. And there's probably not enough population to warrant in all parts of Inaka, Japan. I'm not suggesting there is, but I do think that it is one of the pivotal points of integration that is really difficult. And particularly even in Tokyo, when I lived in Setagaya, there wasn't any supports, and yet we had a fairly robust presence of foreign roots children in the school, and yet there wasn't in the school system that my children were at. So I think it's really about getting a paradigm shift in the Ministry of Education, which, as we know, is one of the more conservative ministries. And so getting that paradigm shift there to say, these people are here to stay, we need to support their education and integration into Japanese society. We need JSL. Like, we need JSL as a permanent infrastructure, for the rest of, the next 100 years of Japanese society. That we haven't seen develop in the same way as I think in Canada we absolutely make it part of the core part of our public education offerings, because there's just been such high levels of ESL. And of course, in Quebec, what they've done is they had national funded daycare system in Quebec province. Mm-hmm. And because you can get access to daycare full time for young children, the toddlers, at age 2, 3, they're already fluent in French by the time they hit elementary because they've been in French daycare. And my children went through the Japanese daycare system and they're fluent in Japanese. There's no problems there because they get it through their daycare. But if you're not a working full-time parent, you can't get access to the Japanese daycare system full-time. And so then those kids are pushed out onto the side if they don't have a full-time working mom and dad to allow them access to get to the Japanese national universities, national daycare system, through which they do absolutely pick up Japanese and become fluent right away. So these are the gaps, right? The gaps in the build out that we're seeing at that level of public policy, and through, I think, what the Monkasho and the Ministry of Education could design and really, really move the dial in exciting ways.
So that kind of explains, because there is a growing number of industry that requires non-Japanese, so foreign personnel to come to Japan to work. Say, for example, the caregiving industry, nurses. Some industries are suffering, and they require, they do want people from outside Japan to come to Japan to work, but they require certain Japanese level. But there is no, from what I hear, is that it's on the prefectural level or municipal level, but not funded by any federal,
for the kids level. For kids education, I would say that's the case, but I think for certain visa statuses and the caregiver and technical training programs, it's through those programs that sometimes they have Japanese language learning, but I think that they're not well built out infrastructure yet. I think that they're kind of piecemeal, and so they get maybe certain supports, but not enough to really make to get completely fluent and to have the level of language ability and comfort to be in serious caregiving and elder care roles, where I think communication and nuanced communication is key. And maybe that's not the degree of the training yet, because it is really seen as they'll be here for a couple of years and then they'll go home. So we're not investing in them to be here for the long term because they're not immigrants. And that's a very different mindset, right? When you're investing for the long term versus, we're just going to have them come work for 3 years and then they'll go back to their home country. If they can just get by with Japanese, maybe that's enough, right? So it's a very different ethical commitment that you're in, and therefore the funding resources are very different.
Okay, I understand.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. Well, we're going to close the room shortly. We are almost 10 minutes past the first, initially intended time. So, Jackie, thank you very much for coming, for the wonderful discussion and your insights into diversity and innovation. And we certainly hope that we can have you again here in the near future. More, yes, indeed, more.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much for coming, everybody.